Langley, Virginia, 1961. A CIA officer typed 4 words into a classified cable destined for Leopoldville, Congo. He is our man. The man they were referring to had been a beer salesman 18 months earlier. He had no military training, no political philosophy, no formal education beyond a Belgian missionary school in the jungle. What he did have was a willingness to do the thing the CIA needed done, and the cold intelligence to understand exactly what that willingness was worth. His name was Joseph Désiré Mobutu, and for the next 32 years, the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth would tell itself a story about him. The story went like this. Mobutu Sese Seko was America's indispensable anti-communist partner in Central Africa. The story was true. What the CIA never admitted, not in its cables, not in its congressional testimony, not in its declassified files, was the other half of the story. Mobutu wasn't their asset. They were his. To understand how a beer salesman from Lisala became the master of the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth, you have to understand what the Congo looked like in 1960. It was the most resource-rich patch of land on the African continent. Cobalt, uranium, copper, diamonds. The uranium that destroyed Hiroshima came from Congolese mines. The cobalt that powered Cold War electronics came from the same soil. Belgium had spent 80 years extracting everything extractable, building nothing that wasn't designed to extract more efficiently, and then, in June 1960, handed a country with almost no trained professionals its independence with 6 months' notice, and walked away. Into that vacuum walked Patrice Lumumba, electrifying, visionary, a man who believed the Congo's resources should belong to the Congolese. He gave a speech at independence that made Belgium's King Baudouin go white. He talked about colonialism without euphemism. He named what had been done. And within weeks of taking office as Prime Minister, he was reaching out to the Soviet Union for help when the West refused to assist with the secession crisis in Katanga province. That single move, that one letter to Moscow, signed his death warrant in Washington. The CIA station chief in Leopoldville, Lawrence Devlin, received a cable from CIA Director Alan Dulles that historians have since confirmed used language strongly suggesting Lumumba's elimination. Washington saw a Soviet foothold forming in the heart of Africa, sitting on top of enough uranium to make a dozen bombs. They needed Lumumba gone. They needed someone else in his place. Someone manageable, someone grateful. They chose the beer salesman. Joseph Désiré Mobutu was 29 years old. He had been a journalist briefly, and then found work as an army sergeant under the Belgians. He had intelligence, real intelligence, the kind that reads people faster than it reads books. He understood, with instinctive precision, that the white men in suits who kept appearing around Leopoldville's independence celebrations were not there out of goodwill. They were shopping, and Mobutu understood what he was selling. He made himself available to Devlin. He was charming, pragmatic, and crucially, ideologically empty. He had no passionate attachment to socialism or nationalism or any ism that might complicate a relationship with Langley. He just wanted power. And the CIA, blinded by the Lumumba problem, read that emptiness as reliability. It was the first of many misreadings. January 17, 1961. Patrice Lumumba was driven to Katanga province, handed to his enemies, beaten and shot. The CIA's precise role in his murder has been debated by historians for 6 decades. What is not debated? The agency knew, the agency wanted him gone, and the agency's chosen man, Mobutu, facilitated his detention. A UN investigation decades later would name multiple foreign intelligence services as bearing moral responsibility for Lumumba's assassination. Mobutu was rewarded, first with CIA money, direct payments to key Congolese military and political figures that flowed through channels Mobutu controlled, then with weapons, then with the tacit approval that is worth more than any weapon, Washington's blessing to consolidate power without interference. In 1965, Mobutu staged a formal coup, declared himself head of state, and issued a 5-year suspension of political activity. The United States did not object. Here is where the story the CIA told itself, begins to fracture. The agency believed it had installed a client, a manageable partner who understood his role in the Cold War architecture, hold the line against Soviet expansion in Central Africa, keep the mines accessible to Western companies, show up at the right summits, and shake the right hands. In exchange, Mobutu would receive money, military support, and protection from any international accountability for whatever he did inside his own borders. What they had actually done was hand a man of extraordinary cunning the keys to an entire country and the international legitimacy to do whatever he wanted with it, as long as he kept saying the right words about communism. Mobutu understood this bargain with crystalline clarity, and he began immediately, systematically, to exploit it. But there was one move Mobutu made in 1973 that should have told Washington everything they needed to know about who was actually running this relationship. A move so audacious that even his own advisors told him it was suicidal. More on that in a moment. First, you need to understand how much money was moving and where it was going. Between 1965 and 1997, Mobutu Sese Seko, he renamed himself in 1971, which we'll come to, received an estimated $5 billion in Western aid, loans, and direct CIA support. Some estimates push the total higher. At the same time, Zaire's national debt climbed from negligible levels at independence to $14 billion by the time he fled the country. The mathematics are brutal in their simplicity. The money came in, the debt accumulated, and somewhere in between, $5 billion went somewhere that wasn't Zaire. It went to Swiss bank accounts. It went to a marble palace in his ancestral village of Badolite, a village so remote it required its own international airport, which Mobutu built at state expense so his Concorde could land there. He chartered the Concorde regularly for shopping trips to Europe, while his country's per capita income collapsed, while cholera moved through Kinshasa's water supply, while teachers went unpaid for months at a time. The technical term economists use for what Mobutu built is kleptocracy, rule by theft. But that term undersells the sophistication of the operation. Mobutu didn't just steal. He designed a system in which theft was the system. He deliberately kept state institutions weak, deliberately kept the army unpaid enough to require side income through corruption, deliberately kept regional governors dependent on his personal favor for any resources at all. Every node of power in Zaire ran through Mobutu, and every node of power was monetized. Western economists watched this happening in real time. The IMF sent mission after mission. World Bank reports used increasingly alarmed language. And then the loans kept coming. Because the alternative, Mobutu falling, Soviet influence filling the vacuum, was always more alarming to Washington than the spectacle of a country being eaten alive by its own leader. Mobutu knew this. He knew it the way a chess player knows a pinned piece. As long as the Cold War continued, as long as he positioned himself as the indispensable anti-communist, he was unfireable, unaccountable, untouchable. Not because he was powerful in any conventional military sense. His army was a running joke among African military analysts. But because he understood the one thing that gave Washington nightmares better than Washington understood it itself. Now, the move from 1973, the one his own advisors said would get him killed. November 30th, 1973. Mobutu stood before the Zairean parliament and announced what he called Zaireanization. All foreign-owned businesses, plantations, mines, factories, retail operations would be seized by the state and redistributed to Zairean citizens, immediately, without compensation. Washington went cold. Belgium erupted. European investors who had been operating in the Congo since the colonial era suddenly found their assets nationalized by decree. This was not the behavior of a reliable American client. This was the kind of move the CIA funded coups to prevent. Except Mobutu wasn't finished talking, because in the same speech, in careful, measured language, he made clear that Zaireanization applied to Western businesses. It did not apply to Zaire's mining contracts with American and Belgian companies, which remained intact. The copper kept flowing to Western markets. The cobalt kept moving through Western supply chains. The uranium arrangements remained untouched. What Mobutu had actually done was seize the retail economy, the grocery stores, the plantations, the mid-tier commercial operations, and hand them to his political allies, converting economic loyalty into personal loyalty at scale, while leaving the extraction industry that Washington actually cared about completely alone. The genius of the move was its optics. To his domestic audience, Mobutu was the African nationalist hero, taking back what colonialism stole. To Washington, he was briefly terrifying, then manageable, because the mines were still open. And the businesses he seized, handed to cronies who had no business experience and ran them into the ground within 18 months, collapsed so completely that Mobutu reversed major portions of Zaireanization by 1976, inviting foreign owners back on new terms that he personally negotiated. He had used an act of economic nationalism to consolidate political control, panic his Western patrons into grateful relief when the mines stayed open, and renegotiate his country's foreign business arrangements from a stronger position, all in under 3 years. The beer salesman had just outmaneuvered the Ivy League strategists at Langley, and nobody at the CIA wrote a cable that said that out loud. There was one man in Washington who finally said it out loud, a Senate investigator in 1975, who looked at the CIA's files on Mobutu and asked a question so obvious it had apparently never been asked before. He looked at $32 million in documented CIA payments and asked, "What exactly did we get for this?" The answer was going to reshape how Washington thought about the entire relationship. But first, Mobutu had one more move to make, one that would put his face on the front page of every newspaper on Earth and make sure nobody asked the Senate's question too loudly. That move was called the Rumble in the Jungle, and it was the most expensive alibi in Cold War history. After 1974's boxing spectacle, which brought Mobutu another cycle of favorable international press, the relationship between Washington and Kinshasa entered its most nakedly transactional phase, Angola. In 1975, following Portuguese colonial withdrawal, Angola descended into civil war between three factions, the MPLA, backed by the Soviet Union and Cuban troops, UNITA, backed by South Africa and eventually the CYA, and the FNLA, which received covert American support channeled through Zaire. Mobutu's territory became the staging ground for the CIA's Angolan operation. CIA officers ran supply lines through Kinshasa. Weapons moved through Zairean airports. Mobutu took a cut. Always. The Senate Church Committee, investigating CIA covert operations in 1975 and 1976, found evidence of the Zaire operations and noted with careful diplomatic language that American support for Mobutu's regime was producing returns that were, at minimum, difficult to measure. The harder finding, the one that kept getting softened in final reports, was that Mobutu was not a tool of American policy. American policy had become a tool of Mobutu's survival strategy. Every new crisis, Angola, then the Shaba province invasions of 1977 and 1978, where Katangan rebels crossed from Angola and nearly toppled the regime, became an opportunity. Mobutu would call Washington. Washington would scramble. French paratroopers, Moroccan troops, Belgian military advisors, American logistical support, all of it rushed in to stabilize a regime that existed primarily to generate the crises that justified its own stabilization. It was a perpetual motion machine of dependency that Mobutu had engineered so completely that dismantling it seemed more dangerous than maintaining it. Jimmy Carter, who came to office talking about human rights, looked at Zaire and blinked. Ronald Reagan, who came to office talking about rolling back communism, embraced Mobutu openly, hosting him at the White House in 1983 as the first African leader of his administration. The photographs from that visit are worth studying. Mobutu in his leopard-skin hat, Reagan smiling. Two men who understood each other perfectly. 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved. And in Langley, in Foggy Bottom, in the corridors of the World Bank, the same question surfaced almost simultaneously. What exactly do we need Mobutu for now? The answer was nothing. The strategic calculation that had made him untouchable for 30 years evaporated in 24 months. Without the Soviet threat, without the Angola proxy war, without the Cold War architecture that made a stable, even if brutally kleptocratic, Central Africa a genuine American interest, Mobutu was just a man who had stolen $5 billion from one of the poorest countries on earth. The money stopped. The IMF, which had extended credit to Zaire through crisis after crisis, suspended lending. American military assistance dried up. The visits to Washington stopped. And without the external support that had propped up his system, the system began to collapse with remarkable speed. Because Mobutu had spent 32 years making sure no institution in Zaire was strong enough to function without his personal management. He had made himself indispensable by making everything else dispensable. Now, without external oxygen, the entire structure began to suffocate. By the mid-1990s, Zaire was effectively ungoverned outside of Kinshasa. The army, never paid reliably, never professionalized, had fragmented into armed bands that preyed on civilians. Infrastructure that had been deteriorating for decades reached collapse. And in the east of the country, the 1994 Rwandan genocide sent 2 million refugees across the border, destabilizing an already disintegrating situation beyond any central government's ability to manage. Laurent Désiré Kabila's forces moved across the country in 1996 and 1997 with almost no resistance. Province after province fell. Mobutu, sick with prostate cancer, shuttled between his palace in Badalite and treatment in Europe, issuing increasingly disconnected statements about the situation. He returned to Kinshasa once, briefly, in 1997. Then he fled. The man who had made himself the unkillable center of everything had built a country so thoroughly hollowed out that it fell in 9 months once the external support disappeared. He died in Rabat, Morocco, in September 1997. 3 months after losing power. Prostate cancer, officially. Irrelevance, truthfully. Here is the accounting the CIA never submitted to Congress. Between 1960 and 1997, the United States invested in money, in weapons, in diplomatic cover, in deliberate blindness to documented atrocities, an estimated $32 million directly through the CIA and billions more through multilateral institutions Washington influenced in the project of keeping Mobutu Sese Seko in power. In exchange, they got a stable anti-communist buffer in Central Africa during the Cold War. What they also got, what they don't put in the ledger, was a country comprehensively destroyed. Not destroyed by civil war, not destroyed by natural disaster, not destroyed by the outside forces the Cold War architects were so afraid of. Destroyed methodically, deliberately, systematically, by the man they chose. Paid, protected, and photographed in the Oval Office. The institutions that might have governed the Congo were never allowed to develop because a strong Congolese state would have been a check on Mobutu, and a check on Mobutu was a check on the CIA's most reliable African partner. The chaos that followed Mobutu's fall, the Congo Wars that killed an estimated 5 million people between 1996 and 2003, making it the deadliest conflict since World War II, didn't come from nowhere. It came directly from 32 years of deliberate institutional destruction, funded largely by American taxpayers who were told their money was defending freedom. Mobutu Sese Seko didn't beat the CIA because he was smarter than they were. He beat them because he understood one thing they refused to understand about themselves. They needed a monster in Central Africa more than they needed an honest accounting of what the monster was doing. And as long as that was true, the monster was always in charge. The leopard skin hat sits in a museum now. The Swiss bank accounts are still frozen. The money still largely unrecovered. The Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, remains one of the poorest countries on earth, despite sitting on an estimated $24 trillion in untapped mineral wealth. The CIA's favorite monster died in a Moroccan hospital bed. The country he hollowed out is still paying the bill.